I would like to request Biplab Pratik, a poet, to welcome our guest with Rudraksha. Thank you, Dai. Thank you so much. And the time for the sessions will be 1 hour. And the time is yours.
Thank you. So I think half of the panelists are not there. So I know only Yatish. I can wrap up it in 15 minutes. So we are going to talk about poetry of present, and also we are going to recite. We are going to listen a few of poems. In 1920, a very famous English novelist and poet D.H. Lawrence wrote a preface in his poetry book, and it was titled uh, Poetry of Present. And in that preface, he said, poetry is all about the glorious past or a dreamy future. So poets write about the magnificence, the excellent national life, cultural heritage, the glory, the heroic act of human being. And from there came our great epics. And sometimes, poet is a dreamer, so he dreams, he sketches something of a future. But writing poetry on present, because present is very imperfect. Present is always a process of making. So in that context, I am going to ask question to all three of you. How do you place yourself as a poet at present? In other words, how do you make yourself relevant as a poet to this time? This time means this particular time. And do you believe that this time is really compatible with poetry, or we are living in a non-poetic time or non-poetic world? Starting from Yatish.
सर्वप्रथम नमस्ते काठमांडू। गोपाल प्रसाद रिमल जी की धरती पे हम आज की कविता की बात कर रहे हैं। एंड रिमल इज अ मुक्तिबोध ऑफ नेपाल, एंड मुक्तिबोध इज nothing but a changer, a game changer in poetry. And whatever yatharth, a poet's responsibility is to depict the yatharth, and whatever he feel going wrong or right, he should put all these things in the world. So you have said that whether we are placing ourselves, the young generation or the today's poet, into the today's time or not, because you have to express whatever you are seeing, and you should become a voice of needed activities, person, place, prithvi, everything. So I think today's generation is doing much more justice to the poetry, to the sahitya, and that is why we are here in Nepal. From India, we gathered here. That is why you can see in last 1 decade, a number of activities in Sahitya has gone up so well, and things are returning back. Rather, I'll put these things in different word that things are returning back from 80s to 2000. There has been a deviation, and if you see 60s to 80s, rich poetry came to Sahitya, whether in Nepal or whether it is in India. Poetess like Parijat of Nepal. You can see here people. A poet has gone into jail for 5 years in Nepal. A great poet, Chitradhar Hriday. If you see, he initially praised the Rajasthan, and then when he wrote Truth, when he wrote Present, he was in jail. So what I'm trying to tell you, poet has to shoulder his responsibility of becoming voice of today, and otherwise he will not be remain in the frame of the poet. Thank you.
Just an additional question. When you're talking about a poet going to jail or being punished for writing, do you believe that uh, we are living in an era where poet is to be an activist? Do you believe in that?
You see, you can't be activist. You can be only voice of those persons जिनकी आवाज सुनी नहीं जा रही, और आप ऐसा नहीं, समय तो वैसे ही रहता है. इनफैक्ट अगर आप 1957 से हम शुरू करें तो वक्त बेहतर ही होता गया. मैं अगर वैसे बोलूं तो मुगल के काल में अगर जाए या राजपूता काल में लगे तो जीवन बेहतर हो रहा है, बेहतर की ओर जा रहा है. लेकिन ये बहुत कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी है, इतना सिंपल वर्ड नहीं है कि मैं बोल दूं कि सब कुछ बेहतर हो गया. बट इक्विटी, इक्वलिटी जिसकी भी बात करें हम, या 2014 का जो हमारा वर्डिक्ट आया इंडिया में कि हम थर्ड जेंडर को हम इक्वल राइट दें, तो त्रेता युग से लग गया कलयुग. एक जेंडर मतलब किन्नर को आप, एक थर्ड जेंडर को आप इक्वल देने में, तो मैं कह रहा हूं कि ये तो बेटरमेंट ही है. लेकिन बेटरमेंट का भी कोई पैमाना नहीं है. लेकिन जितना भी डिफरेंस है आइडियलिज्म और यथार्थ में, कवि का काम है कि उस दोनों के गैप को माप करके, मेजर करके प्रत्यक्ष सामने रखना.
Thank you. The next I'm going to, pardon me, I don't know your names, please, because I'm for the first time I'm meeting you both. You are? Your name is, please?
Ashmita Manandar.
Asmita, and of Geeta Tripathi. Okay, now this going to Asmita, and putting the same question in a different context. Context is, are we? Is poetry becoming a force to achieve the democratic goal? Do you believe that poetry is contributing anything in any manner to strengthen the democratic goal? It's globally, and it's not only Nepal or South Asia or India,
Yeah.
but do we as poet are really instrumental to do something to democratize the society?
First, I'd like to go back to your first question.
Yeah.
When you were talking about, is poetry relevant in present day? Well, I always believed, whenever I wrote, I always believed that poetry is very subjective. It's, like the basic foundation of poetry is like you write what you feel. So it can be very subjective and it has no boundaries as well. But I also feel that poetry is not written to be relevant. And I think this will answer both of your questions, actually. To really introduce myself, I'd like to say that both of my parents are also poets and they're present here. And I have been in the environment of poetry, let's say, since the time I knew like what contained, like what it is to be a poem, like to write a poem, let's say. And also, a poet is not an activist, but a poetry can fuel a very strong force for activism. I can see that, I can feel that. And my generation and generations before me, we've seen that when we had Jana Andolan here, inculcated into the Republic of Nepal. And there's also there's one example I'd like to give you. There's a poem that my mother wrote, and it is called Ama Timro Naam Ke Ho. In English, it's Mother, what is your name? And it is about how women in Nepal, they cannot endow citizenship in their name to their children, and yet they cannot. And she wrote that poem, I don't know when. She wrote that poem. I have heard that poem since I've heard her reciting poems, and it is still relevant. If I have a kid tomorrow, it will still be relevant to me. So poems are not written to be relevant. It's just the poems bring relevance to the issues, I feel like. And yes, their poems are very strong force in bringing forth the activism, or say the democratic or the republic or whatever change the world can bring. And also, just to not to cut you, but just to say that we don't use third gender anymore. We use queer here, politically correctly. So can we please use that word from here on? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a brilliant point. Poet is not necessarily to be an activist, but poetry can evoke activism. And when you're talking about poet does not write to be for relevance, but poetry is for relationships. Very recently, an Indian poet, an Indian English poet died. His name was Jayanta Mahapatra. He died at the age of 95. And his famous poetry collection is known as Relationships. And he always said that poetry is all about relationship, to make bonding, to extend yourself to the other self. So now it's up to Geeta ji. How you see the relevance actually? Yati has a perspective, she has a perspective, and what is your idea of poetry at present?
धन्यवाद. You just said about Jayanta Mahapatra. My hearty condolence to him. हमने भी उनसे मिलने का वो टाइम पाया था वो 2010 में.
Okay, that's great.
जिस टाइम पर वो बहुत पीड़ा में था कैंसर का.
He was sick at that time, but he is one of the greatest survivors that we have seen.
Yeah, I know. मैं नेपाली में बोलने
Yeah,
comfortable feel
I will
करती हूँ.
try to understand. No problem.
जी.
And
It's okay.
actually, the sound is so familiar that I don't find myself out of place. Actually, I can follow Nepali.
Okay. मेरा छोटा पोएम है नेपाली में, वो रिसाइट करके मैं सुरु करती हूँ. हामी सानो छँदा, when we are very young, हामी सानो छँदा लालटिन बाल्थ्यौं साँझमा र पढ्न बस्थ्यौं मिलेर वरिपरि. हामी सानो छँदा लालटिन बाल्थ्यौं साँझमा र पढ्न बस्थ्यौं मिलेर वरिपरि. लालटिन भन्दा उज्याला थिए आँखाहरू, आँखा भन्दा उज्याला थिए अक्षरहरू. हामी अक्षरको उज्यालोमा बाटो खोज्ने गर्थ्यौं. हामी सानो छँदा जुन बाल्थ्यौं आँखामा, उठाउँथ्यौं रित्ता गाग्राहरू. गाग्रा भन्दा रित्ता थिए अँधेरी खोजहरू. खोज भन्दा गहिरो थियो हाम्रो मन. हामी मनको कुवामा रित्ता गाग्राहरू बाउँथ्यौं. हामी सानो छँदा हाम्रो यात्रा थियो. सम्भावनाका असंख्य गोरेटाहरू थिए. तर कहाँ रोकिए होलान् आज ती हाम्रो यात्री मन र असंख्य गोरेटाहरू. धन्यवाद. मेरो यो कविताले भन्न खोजेको चाहिँ, कविताले आफ्नो समयलाई सम्बोधन गर्छ. When I was so young, त्यति बेलाको मेरो परिवेशमा सपना थियो, इमेजिनेसनहरू धेरै हुन्थ्यो. हामी सानो सानो कुरामा पनि एकदम ह्यापी हुन्थ्यौं. तर जब जब हामी बुझ्दै जान्छौं, हामीलाई देश काल परिस्थिति राजनीतिले चाहिँ आफ्नो तर्फ तान्छ. हाम्रो बाल्यकालको एउटा सुमधुर स्वतन्त्र आकाश नै हाम्रो सम्पूर्ण रहस्यको एउटा यात्रा गर्ने ठाउँ हो जस्तो लाग्ने सपनाहरू चाहिँ बिस्तारै विभाजित हुँदै जान्छन् र हामी साँघुरो हुँदै जान्छौँ। हामीलाई पढाइन्छ, हामी धेरै पढेपछि, धेरै बुझेपछि, धेरैतिर भाग लिएपछि हामी चाहिँ विस्तृत बन्दै जान्छौँ भन्ने हाम्रो बुझाइ हुन्छ। तर वास्तवमा हामीले साँच्चै आफूलाई इटर्नल्ली हेर्ने हो भने हामी झन् साँघुरो हुँदै जाँदो रहेछौँ र हामी विभाजित हुँदै जाँदो रहेछौँ विभिन्न कुराहरूले। र नेपालको कन्टेक्स्टमा खास गरी अघि गोपाल प्रसाद रिमालको नाम लिनुभयो र रिमालहरूको परिवेशदेखि हामीले आजसम्म पनि गणतन्त्रको यात्रासम्म आउँदाखेरि हामीले कविताको विषयहरूलाई चाहिँ विस्तृत गर्न पाएको छैन। हाम्रो राजनीतिले हाम्रो कविताको चेतनालाई चाहिँ बन्दी बनाएर राखिदिएको छ। हामी जीवन र प्रकृतिको कविताभन्दा विमुख भइरहेका छौँ। हामीले आफ्नो राजनीतिक स्टेबिलिटीको लागि र विकास निर्माणको लागि भनेर नै हाम्रा अधिकांश उर्वर समयहरू जहाँ कविताको साधना गर्नुपर्ने हो, चिन्तन गर्नुपर्ने हो, त्यसबाट हामी बायस भएर बाँच्नु परिरहेको छ। यदि हामीलाई साँच्चै स्वतन्त्र रूपमा एउटा आफ्नो कवि हुनुको अनुभूतिसँग बाँच्ने मौका हुन्थ्यो भने हाम्रो कविताले अर्कै लय पक्रिन पाउँथ्यो। तर आजसम्म हामीले कविताहरू जति लेख्दै गइरहेका छौँ, एक्टिभिजम हुन्छ कि हुँदैन भन्ने सवालमा हाम्रो त कविताले त्यही नै काम गर्नु परेको छ। थ्याङ्क यू।
Okay, thank you, Gitaji. I cannot say that I follow entirely, but whatever I could understand. Next, let's read poem. Talking about poetry is not the business of poets. Again, I am quoting a very famous Odia poet called Ramakant Rath. He always tell, do you ever say a dancer to talk about dancing? You are there to see the dance of the dancer. So why do you say poets to talk on poetry? So let's read poetry and start with Yatis. Yatis can recite a couple of his poems. Okay. You take your time and 2-3 poems.
नहीं, पहले तो एक बात जो पिछली बार कहना चाह रहा था छूट गया था कि हम जो कवि हैं उनको ईश्वर ने देवत्व बख्शा है कि वो क्षण हमें प्रदान किया जाता है जिस क्षण में हम कविता लिखते हैं। हम वैसे तो कविता कभी नहीं लिख सकते और हम सब उस ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन के अंदर जाते हैं, फिर वहां लिखते हैं। मुझे आज कोई कह दे कि यहाँ आप कविता लिख दो, इस सब्जेक्ट पे कविता लिख दो, मैं नहीं लिख पाऊँ, हम में से कोई नहीं लिख पाएगा। इस बात को समझना जरूरी है और हम लोगों को भी समझना जरूरी है कि हम ब्लेस्ड हैं, हम चोजन हैं। सो इसके साथ ही मैं बहुत छोटी कविता जो हर एक पिता अपनी बेटी के लिए कहना चाहेगा उससे शुरुआत करना चाहूंगा। शीर्षक है सबसे प्यारी हंसी। जब तुम हंसती हो तुम्हारी ठुड्डी हौले से छू लेता हूं, हथेली में हर श्रृंगार भर जाता है। जब तुम हंसती हो तो तुम्हारी ठुड्डी हौले से छू लेता हूं, हथेली में हर श्रृंगार भर जाता है। जब तुम हंसती हो तो तुम्हारे घुंघराले बालों से हजारों जुगनुओं की भीड़ उड़ती है, जिंदगी रोशनी से भर जाती है। जब तुम हंसती हो तो मकई की बालियों से मोती झांकने लगता है। जब तुम हंसती हो तो लगता है सैकड़ों दाने कंसार में भूंजा बन साथ साथ फूट रहे हैं। और जब तुम हंसती हो तो फुंगनियां भी डोलना भूल जाती है, पृथ्वी अपनी धुरी पे घूमना भूल जाती है, चांद चहलकदमी नहीं करता, टकटकी लगाकर तुम्हें ताकता है। और जब तुम हंसती हो तो हजारों कंचे एक साथ धरती का माथा चूमते हैं। और जब तुम हंसती हो तो पिता का सीना समंदर हो जाता है और बंद
You're talking about relationship when poetry is building relationship. Well, like I said, my father writes very political poems, and my mother writes very feminist poems. But when I started writing poems, my poems were very personal, you know, and so it took me quite a long time to come out in public and recite my poems because I used to feel that they're not like really, you know, for public consumption or something like that. So what I felt as I went on writing is that poetry also builds a relationship to yourself. It's a way of building a relationship with yourself as well. And so this, at one point of time when, like you said, we're blessed to have this, you know, artists come to us. So at one such time, this is what I wrote. The disaster and salvage of my gift is that the emptiness I feel is the reason my notebooks are filled. When I run out of inked pages, should I grieve the absence of my art, or should I rejoice my fulfilled heart? With that, I'd like to recite one of my Nepali poems to begin with. मेरो अर्को कविता चाहिँ नेपालीमा छ र यसको शीर्षक चाहिँ मैले सुबोल सुबोल राखेको छु र यो कविता चाहिँ मैले कहिले लेखेको थिएँ भन्दाखेरि हाम्रो बगैँचामा चाहिँ एउटा काग आएर बसेको थियो र त्यो कागले चाहिँ अलिकति घाउ लागेको जस्तो देखिरहेको थियो कि त्यो कागकोमा खुट्टामा अनि हामीले चाहिँ त्यो कागलाई पट्टी लगाउने कि भनेर कोसिस गऱ्यौँ तर त्यस्तो चाहेको जस्तो हामीले लागेन हामीलाई तैपनि हामीले चाहिँ समातेर पट्टी लगायौँ र 2-3 दिन चाहिँ त्यो काग यतिकै लङ्गडो गर्दै हाम्रो बगैँचा वरिपरि नै बस्यो खान पनि मानेन पानी पनि पिउन मानेन र तेस्रो दिन चाहिँ ऊ मर्यो अनि हामीले चाहिँ हाम्रै बगैँचामा चाहिँ उसलाई गाड्यौँ पनि र त्यो 3 दिनको जुन कागसँगको सम्बन्ध थियो मेरो त्यसलाई समेटेर चाहिँ मैले यो कविता लेखेको हो र फेरि पनि शीर्षक दोहोऱ्याएँ मैले सुबोल सुबोल पङ्खले सुस्केर हालेर बतास बतास बेफिक्री उडान भरेको आकाश आकाश आज बिछट्टै अन्जान पो भएछ भन्छे मलाई एउटी काली चरी आज थाहा भयो एक मुठी माटोको मोल सुबोल सुबोल म वर्तमान भविष्य र भूत हेर्न सक्ने कथक म मृत्युको दूतको एउटा मिथक आज टुटेको शरीरको मात्रै छ भर्थेग भन्छे मलाई एउटी काली चरी आज एक हुने छौँ म र यो सम्पूर्ण भूगोल सुबोल सुबोल कहिले यमको वाहन कहिले परिवर्तनको निशान कहिले यमको वाहन कहिले परिवर्तनको निशान आज खोज्दै छे मेरो बगैँचामा आफ्नै चिहान अन्त्यको आगमन आफसे आप हुन्छ भन्छे मलाई एउटी काली चरी आज सुरुवातको ढोका खोल सुबोल सुबोल थ्याङ्क यू And one more in English for everybody's taste palette. This one is titled Inheritance. The colorful triangles with red bordered shawl reminds me of a face I have no memory of. When my mother flings it over her shoulders, I wonder if she ever ponders of your time, your thoughts, or the life you sought. Someday it shall make my acquaintance, handed over like a piece of inheritance of my mother from hers, or our shared angs that shall merge. If so, whisper to me gently through the threads woven carefully of stories you left untold, or wisdom you see me hold. Our freedom from the mortal bond reminds me of your face I have no memory of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asmita.
For now, I think that'll be it. Then we can continue like Yati said.
Yeah, Geeta ji.
धन्यवाद. So beautiful poems. And your poem that for your youngest daughter, it was so sweet. हम सोच रहे थे आपने इतनी अच्छा पोएम लिखा छोटी सी बेटी के लिए, जैसा लगता है क्या बेटी जब बड़ी हो जाती है पापा ऐसा ही फील करता है, ज्यादातर रोने को मिलता है बेटी को, उसके बारे में भी पोएम लिखना चाहिए आपको. अटूट शीर्षक का पोएम है मेरा एक. आपकी वो पोएम का नाम पानी का, मेरा भी वैसा ही प्रेम और पानी का. अटूट. जब शीर्षस्थ हुन्छौ तिमी मेरा हरफहरू गीत भएर बग्न थाल्छन् तिमीतिरै. तिम्रो केन्द्रदेखि मेरो परिधिसम्मको अनन्त दूरीमा लाग्छ बगिरहेछ युगौँदेखि विश्वासको एक अटुट नदी. पानी छौन्जेल नदीमा किनारहरू सहयात्रामै हुन्छन् सधैँ. पानी छौन्जेल नदीमा किनारहरू सहयात्रामै हुन्छन् हर समय. यही समयको एउटा सहयात्री म उमारेर सम्पूर्ण स्मृतिका तरङ्गहरू त्यही नदीमा तिम्रो गीतको मिठो धुन पर्खिरहनेछु अटुट. धन्यवाद. एक कविता.
Okay, you can read another one.
मैंने जो पोएम पहले वाचन किए थे उनका इंग्लिश में ही मैं ट्राई करती हूँ. When we were very young, when we were very young, we'd light the lantern in the evening and sit to study together all around. Eyes were brighter than the lantern. Letters were brighter than the eyes. We'd search for the path in the letters of illumination. When we were very young, we'd light the moon in the eyes and lift with care the empty water pots. The dark caverns were emptier than the pots. Our heart was deeper than the cavern. We'd fill up from heart's eternal well the empty water pots. When we were very young, we had our journey, had many trails of possibilities. Where might have halted today those countless paths and our travel heart. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Geeta. I think, should I recite one or two of my poems?
Yes, I was going to tell that. He's not a moderator, he's a great poet.
I'm not great, but I don't know the poem that I'm going to read now, whether it's a political poem or a personal poem. The poem is titled Story of a Cage. I live in a cage, free and fine. I live in a cage, free and fine. A cage with golden bars. It was wide and spacious. There was facilities of food and water. Everything was tiny and beautiful inside the cage. From the cage, you can see the window and a little bit of the sky. From the cage, you can dream about the flying and the gliding. From the cage, you can jump from this world to the other world and live there all happily. There is free speech within that cage. There is free movement within that cage. There is democracy within that cage. Every day I sing the song of the cage. The cage is the most beautiful and the most precious one. The owner of the cage is the good of this world. The cage is divine. The cage is the sovereign land of my heaven. I vow I must protect the border of my cage. I vow I must protect the boundary of my cage. I sing for the cage. I write an anthem for the cage. I celebrate the independence of the cage. I am free inside my cage. I love my cage. So this is so next poem I want to recite. It's a poem about my mother. So in Odia it is said, "Mo mara thakura ghara." It's God of my mother. My mother's God is always with her in many a forms and guise, many a color and markers, sometimes as a woman and at times as a young man. From among the 33 crores of gods, I know not who is her God. At times, he is manifest as a tree in our front yard, at times as a colored pattern made out of white rice flour, or like the moon in the sky, or the sun in the morning. Like a block of stone or a wooden form, or just a living, breathing human being like us. I cannot understand who comes to her as God. And nor do I know how his form changes. Sometimes the God has 1,000 hands and feet, and at other times he's just a log of wood. Sometimes he's an ocean, at times a river, sometimes a jungle, or at times a paddy field, or at some other times like the birds. My mother's God received my mother's God receives prayers by some form or other. She says she has seen her God and she cries before him, or at times she cries aloud, saying her God is very cruel. Though she carries on her quarrel or picked hot with her God, and she never led me into her God's sanctum, saying, I am an atheist, and knowing that God has protected me throughout. She always bows down before her, and I always stay sidestepping her God. Be it the august little seat of her God, her offerings, or her sandalwood box, or the Bhagavata Purana sprinkled all over with sandal paste, and the sacred basil plant adorned with her lakh bangles, and her goddess with her red velvet dress and tongues of fire, or her deformed gods without hands or feet, like our Jagannath. I always sidestep all these. Though it is true, though, how much I try to ignore her God, she always finds a God in me, and to her little world of ours is nothing. I am the abode of the God. The translation is a little bit weird because in Odia it's a bit different, but I I I uh, I found the translation is inadequate. I wrote a series of poem on my mother. So actually, I have a fight with my mother because I don't believe in. I don't go to temples. If I go to temple, it's only to see the art and architecture. So we have a sweet fight, lovely fight. She always believed that I am an atheist and I should not enter into her temple, into her God's place. Uh, but she always said that no, God saves you, God protects you, and I believe that okay, all right. So that fight in Odia it comes out very beautifully, but in English it's a bit weird. But thank you very much for this lovely session, for some good poems. Thank you, Asmita, Gitaji, and a dear friend Yatis. It's good to share a few poetic thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I would like to request our esteemed speakers to accept our token of appreciations. And I would like to invite Biplab Pratik, a poet, to hand over the token of appreciation.
Everywhere, a part of body there. That's beauty of Asian. I would say not Indian. All of us, all of us.
अच्छा अगर कोई बोलेंगे तो फिर उसको तो दिल की गहराई में जाते हैं
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, and I would like to request all of you for the group photo. Thank you, Biplab Dai, Kedar Misra, Dr. Gita Tripathi, Asmita